Let's get started. We have three speakers who are going to try to tell you a story about that we hope you haven't, that is a little bit new to you. You know, we always talk about GDP and job growth and things like that. And we're all going to have, once they're all done, everybody's going to sit over here. That's what these seats are for. And you can all ask them questions. And you're not necessarily confined to the topics they talk about, because these guys are smart and they know something about everything. Nah. All right, so the first speaker, Jesus Canas. I have had a past life with him. We both used to, he still works at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. I used to work there. And so he studies, his beat is Mexico and the border. And so he's going to tell you about some research that he's done regarding the thing you probably don't hear much about the border, because all you hear about is the immigration crisis. But this is about trade. Jesus, take it away.
Thank you, Rick, for inviting me. Yes, my name is Jesus Canas. I've been with the Fed several years, and one of my areas of expertise is the Mexican economy, but also how the interaction between U.S. and Mexico benefits the Texas border. And that's the topic of my presentation. So how Texas benefits from trade with Mexico. And the easiest way or the most significant impact is along the border, right? And that's what I will show you in a minute. Before I start, the usual disclaimer applies. Everything that I will say is my own, and it doesn't reflect the Fed's, the Dallas Fed, or the Federal Reserve System. So this is the outline of my presentation. Just a brief discussion about NAFTA, what has happened since then. Now is USMCA, of course. And then I will talk about the US-Mexico economic integration via the manufacturing system, and then going to Texas, and finally how or what's the role of the border in this US-Mexico trade relationship. So just really fast and brief, because I'm pretty sure all of you are familiar with NAFTA. Before NAFTA, the average tariff that U.S. used to pay for imports from Mexico was about 10%. And the average tariff that Mexican companies had to pay importing U.S. Goods was about 2%, right? So sometimes we think that when NAFTA came in, the one that benefited the most from this agreement was Mexico, but it was not the case, right? I mean, the U.S. side was the one that saw the lowest decrease in tariffs, right? After 4 years, those tariffs went to 2.1 for Mexico and for the U.S. and 2.7 for Mexico, and currently is almost zero tariffs when we trade between the two countries. Then, if we talk about the increase in trade due to NAFTA, we can see here this chart shows trade growth between 1993 and 2003, and you can see that trade between U.S. and Mexico has increased almost 500% in exports. But if we talk about total trade including imports, growth has been close to 600% in real terms. So one of the objectives was to increase trade, and it has happened, right? Another objective of NAFTA was to increase bilateral investment between the two countries, right? And if we look at this chart, you can see average pre-NAFTA investment per year of U.S. in Mexico, which is the blue. The pre-NAFTA is the blue, and then the after NAFTA, average investment in Mexico after NAFTA is in gray. And you can see that before NAFTA, U.S. Annual investment in Mexico via FDI was $1.9 billion. After NAFTA, that average went up to $9.8 billion per year, right? When we look at Mexican investment in the U.S. before NAFTA, 0.3%. I mean, 0.3 billion, $300,000 on average before NAFTA. After NAFTA, the average has gone up to $2 billion per year, right? So in terms of increase in trade and bilateral investment, NAFTA now, USMCA, has been a great success, right? After NAFTA, the correlation between manufacturing systems and manufacturing sectors increased, right? This chart shows you the correlation between US manufacturing production and Mexico's manufacturing production before and after NAFTA. And as you can see, the correlation really increased a lot after NAFTA, right? And this is due to the fact that the manufacturing system that we share is what we call intra-industry trade, right? We basically produce the same good, but at different stages of production, right? So we manufacture once a little bit in Mexico, and then we complement that with the US or vice versa, right? So if we look at the average value of, or the originated value of imports from Mexico in the US is about 40 cents. So from every dollar that we import from Mexico, 40 cents have been already originated in the US. So this trade relationship is a win-win, right? It's not that we just import goods from Mexico, but a lot of those imports originated in the US in this kind of intra-industry trade exchange that I mentioned before. What is very important here is that the US originated component of imports from China, US component from imports from China is only about 4 cents per dollar, right? So when we trade within North America, we help each other, right? Via this kind of exchange that we have. And if we just correlate the intermediate goods imports from Mexico and US exports, we can see almost a one-to-one relationship. This chart here shows you imports from Mexico, intermediate imports from Mexico, which are like the base of this intra-industry trade that I just mentioned. And that's in blue. And then in red, we have total US exports to the world. So this kind of trade exchange that we have helps the US to be more competitive abroad, right? So we complement that manufacturing process within North America, making American companies more competitive abroad when they export, right? The green line here is consumer imports from Mexico, which those consumer goods are the ones that compete head-to-head with US producers, right? Because they are consumer goods and is the minority of the trade between US and Mexico. What is the most common example of those consumer goods imports from Mexico? Can you tell me which one it is? One of the most avocados, right? That's an example of import that will compete with the US, right? Because these intermediate goods are not like they will compete with American companies. It's the other way around, right? They will complement that manufacturing process. So now what about Texas, right? So this chart shows you exports, Texas exports before and after NAFTA. And as you can see, the growth has been tremendously after NAFTA, right? And why? Well, because Texas borders with a lot, like four Mexican states, right? So it's the main door for this trade exchange, right? It has gone, growth has averaged, Texas exports growth has averaged 40% per year versus only 8% per year when we look at growth in US exports without Texas, right? That has allowed Texas to become the #1 exporting state, right, since 2002. Texas exports around 450 billion every year, so it's the #1 by a lot, right? California is #2 with less than $200 billion per year, right? What do we export to Mexico? Well, if you see this chart, you can see that the #1 export to Mexico is petroleum and energy-related products, right? So that petroleum and coal products is basically gasoline. We have chemicals too, right? We have oil and gas, right? But after that, those energy-related exports, what we export to Mexico are these goods that are, the base for this intra-industry trade relationship that I mentioned before, right? So what is the role of the border in this exchange? Okay, I'm pretty sure you know this, but let me show you this nice exercise. This is, I took this from a Bloomberg article in 2007, but it kind of explains graphically the way we trade between the two countries, right? Everything starts by importing an electrical component from Asia, right? So it goes to this company in the middle of the US, right? It's importing this electrical component. Then that electrical component is sent to Ciudad Juarez, that borders with El Paso, Texas, where it is assembled into a circuit board in Ciudad Juarez, right? Then that component goes back to El Paso, right, to a warehouse to stay there until it's needed for the continuation of this manufacturing process. Later, that component crosses back to Mexico again to this Matamoros plant in Tamaulipas, right? Where it is assembled into these automatic seat controls that we use now to move the seats of our cars, right? Finally, that component is sent to US, to Texas, and Canada to take place, to finish that production process and complete the seats, right, that are going to be used later in GM automobiles in Fort Worth, in Arlington, Texas, right? That's the GM plant in this example, and then in this other Ford plant in Canada, right? So when we talk about taxing, like sometimes we listen to this crazy idea, right? And they say, well, I'm going to tax US-Mexico trade, and then immediately goes to my mind at what stage of production, right? Like at the very beginning, or like the second time it goes back to Mexico, or when, right? Is the way we exchange goods is not that, it's complicated and complex into this intra-industry trade mechanism. So how does the border benefits from all this? Well, about 75% of US-Mexico trade, close to 430 billion, crosses via Texas port of entry, right? So the border benefits by servicing these trade flows, right? So when manufacturing activity goes up 10% in the Mexican side, like in Ciudad Juarez, employment grows about 2.7% on the US side. This is based on research that we have done in the past. So when manufacturing activity goes up 10% in Reynosa, Tamaulipas, Mexico, employment grows on average about 6.5% in McAllen, Texas. So that's how the border benefits from this cross-border manufacturing relationship that we have. If we look at services, the impact is even larger, right? Because the great majority of the manufacturing process now takes place on the Mexican side, right? And then when we import back those goods, these border regions provide services to those trade flows, right? So that has, allowed the border to get better, right? I'm not saying that this is only due to the increased trade between US and Mexico after NAFTA. I'm just saying that before NAFTA, unemployment along the border was much, much higher than it currently is, right? For example, in McAllen, 18.3% before NAFTA. Now is down to single digits, and right now it's 6%, right? In El Paso, used to be 9%, now it's 4.5%. So that's how the border has benefited. Then this is new research that Rick was talking about. We utilize light intensity from satellite images taken by NASA as a proxy of economic activity along the border. Because, two countries, different way to compute, to record statistics. It's really hard to have the same kind of statistics in both sides of the border to do research, right? And so maybe in one side you have like the most current data and the other one is lagged, right? So we use this light intensity to measure what the border is. We have different definitions of border. All of them administrative, political administrative definitions, like counties from both sides. In the Mexican side is municipalities, right? Counties on the US side. Or we have border states in one side or the other side. We have the La Paz Agreement. We have La Paz Agreement that goes back to back to 1983, when they defined the border as 62 miles north and 62 miles south, that will be perfect. That will be the border region, right? So what we did, we look at this light intensity, and then we compute the correlation between that light intensity, the long-term correlation between that light intensity, and then we measure that correlation every 5 kilometers down and north, right, to define the border. And what we found is that the border is up to 125 kilometers on the Mexican side and up to 55 kilometers on the US side, right? In terms of that co-integration in economic activity. That was the base for this definition, right? And what is very important here is that wherever that happens in the first 5 kilometers in both sides of the border has the greatest economic impact in the whole region, right? And talking about all the problems that we have right now along the border, right? All this congestion or these, secondary revisions and things like that, that the only thing that are doing to this cross-border relationship that I just described is making it less efficient, right? So again, then if you look at the city level, you see that the cities are more correlated, co-integrated with the US economy than the Mexican economy, right? So this same kind of economic activity along the border with the US, right, makes the border the perfect candidate for all these nearshoring investment, right? Because they are already integrated into this kind of manufacturing system, right? With that, I will conclude and happy to answer questions at the end. Thank you.
Yes, Mike. Thank you, Jesus. Now, this is like old home week for the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. Mike Cox, our next speaker, was once the chief economist at the Dallas Fed. He left there to become the founding director of the O'Neill Center, which has morphed into the Bridwell Institute. Anyway, Mike.
Okay, so before we get granular, I am going to get a little bit back to big. When I was here last time, I talked about whether Texas has lost its mojo, and the answer was no, and it's still no. Our main mojo being oil production, which just hit another record high of all time, 5.6 million barrels daily. So we're still rocking and rolling in our main dimension here. But of course, you can't make an economy on oil anymore. It's relatively a small part of our economy. Overall, the Texas economy is the fastest growing economy in the country with the fastest record growth rate for the nation, 6.5% growth in 2003. If I take you to the MSA level, I can't get data that goes to 2023. It's not produced at that level yet. Were it produced to that level, though, I think we would find, since DFW is the fastest growing metropolitan area in Texas, and we're the fastest growing state, that we would have beat out Miami and be the fastest growing metropolitan area in Texas. I know it's true in terms of job growth. So things stay good here, but we have to keep, changing with the economy as the economy goes through creative destruction, and we have to make sure we stay up with the growing sectors. One of those sectors, of course, has been the cloud. And the question is our head in the clouds? Now, I'm going to use the term DFW and Dallas here interchangeably. Sorry, but it's just going to happen. Get over it. All right. Now, it was July 2002. I remember this. I've been alive since then. When Amazon started putting out these servers, AWS, and they had no competitors, but also no cases with which to convince clients of their usefulness, but they apparently were useful, and people figured that out. It was in August 2006 when Eric Schmidt first introduced the term cloud in a industry conference, and it just kept growing and growing. The number of hyperscale data centers, which I'll describe in a minute for those who don't know what they are, hit around 600 in the year 2020. It's up to nearly 1,000 now across the globe. So it just keeps growing. There are three kinds of data centers. Enterprise data centers, like American Airlines may have their own little big data center at their own shop on site. Could be there where they have their operation at the airport. It could be off site, but it serves their own IT needs. Co-location data centers, such as at the Infomart over here, is huge. And they rent out space to a lot of different companies. So read that. Then there's the hyperscale data centers, the massive centralized and custom single company built facilities that support primarily cloud service providers and large internet companies with enormous computing, storage, and networking requirements. Thousands of servers, millions of square feet, cost up to $1 billion or more to construct. There's some that are like $2.5 billion. They locate just outside of major cities where the land is cheaper, but they still have access to the water and the electricity that's provided by that major city. And I'm going to give you all this. And so they have access to the land and the power and the water. And those two can be of two types. They can be wholly owned and used only by the company who built it, or they can be leased out their services, okay? And so the ones that are enterprise, the on-site are shrinking because there's returns to scale from getting somebody else to do it for you. And I mean, who wants to bring all that water and electricity to their otherwise building where they're trying to have their operation going? Co-location have grown, but the biggest growth has been in the hyperscale centers, okay? Here's where they are. Here's where all these every type other than the enterprise are across the U.S. I'm just going to talk about U.S. locations today. This is where they are, thanks to Baxtel, which has done a painstaking analysis of all this. And you notice, I'm sure everybody sees this strip that goes here, mainly up to Virginia, but up the East Coast. We'll come back and talk about why in just a minute or two. But we have some here, there's some in the West Coast, as you see. And there's quite a few in Texas. You might see, for example, Amazon's web server, and Amazon in San Antonio is a part of this, and they could be leasing out space to others, or they could be having it all for themselves. Then there's Microsoft, Azure, up in Virginia, which I'll save what they do in a minute with that. And then there's here in Dallas the Infomart, which is a co-location center. That's an example of what the three kinds of centers there might be here. Who and where are the hyperscalers? Well, Google is, of course, a hyperscaler. They have 13 locations here in the U.S., and one of them is in Dallas. Good. There are 15 Amazon hyperscale data centers. Here's where they're located. 2 of them are in Texas, Dallas, and in Houston. There are 17 Meta cloud data centers. Here's where they're located. 3 of them are in Texas. The biggest one is in our state, is in Fort Worth, and that's where they're located. And Microsoft has the most, and they're kind of like just regional. They just give you, we have big regions where we have these things. I put little green boxes around government or DOD to kind of give you a hint as where we're going to lead with this concept of what's going on with these meta centers, these mega centers. Apple only has 11 worldwide and only 5 of them are in the United States, so they're not the big player in this. There are others, but these are the big ones. Now, back to this map and this big conglomeration of data centers up here in northwestern Virginia and along the coast. What do you have up here? A lot of states, a lot of governments. You have very close to the federal government. Up here in the U.S., of the hyperscale data centers, 53% of those are in the U.S., and by far the biggest share of those are in Virginia. Okay? Now, here are the Microsoft Azure cloud data centers, and notice what Microsoft is doing. It's very smart. 1,183 federal government agencies and 4,343 state and local government agencies use Microsoft services. Who's got more data, more information on people, on anything, on everything than the government? And no servers of their own, and no efficiency at, well, let's just say they're inept at everything, and they need somebody else to do it for them, and they have a huge unlimited budget with money to spend. Well, I don't have to answer that. You've already answered it. You know who's got it, and so Microsoft taps into all this giant market, and here we are in Texas with a lot of space, but a small government, not a lot of other governments nearby. The East Coast is littered with governments all around them, small states, one government after another, state governments and the federal government. So they're lined up with, Amazon's clouds to serve them. So Dallas is not hyperscaler haven. That's the bad news, or maybe the good news, because unless we become surrounded here by a massive federal, state, and local government bureaucracy who has no data center infrastructure of their own, but does have a multi-trillion-dollar budget to spend, then it's unlikely we're ever going to be a really big player in the hyperscale data center space. Okay, so be it. So how are we doing the co-location? Medium size. How are we doing in the co-location data center space? We're number one. Dallas has more co-location centers than any other city in the U.S. with 103, edging out Chicago. And what are the key factors determining the location of a co-location data center? Well, you can think about it and you can read about it. You kind of come to the same conclusion. Of course, it's the cost of locating that plant. And here are those factors: the availability and cost of electricity, water, land, cost of living for the people who are going to live there, and that includes the taxes that those people have to pay to live in that state, and then the proximity to the customers. And I have this kind of listed in reverse order of importance, beginning with the proximity to customers. Well, that's kind of hard to tell. So in trying to come up with some good way of figuring out what that might be, I decided to look at each of the 20 largest cities' location in the United States to its proximity to the population center of the United States, which is Hartfield, Missouri, H-A-R-T. And that's, Dallas is the closest to the population center of the United States of any of these 12 MSAs. Okay, good. We're near people, and that helps us to some dimension, I suppose. What about land costs? Well, you do have to buy some land, but truthfully, these other costs, water and electricity, as it turns out, which are ongoing costs, are so high that even land is not a very big factor. But here it is. There are other places in America where it's cheaper to live. Houston's cheaper to live than Dallas, for the land, that is, and Columbus is less expensive. But land is not very expensive here, but it's really expensive in California, mostly, and in New York. So land costs are fairly inexpensive here. And near the major city where you might locate, like in Arizona, it would be Mesa, some outside of Phoenix, for example. But here you would locate outside in one of the small suburbs surrounding Dallas. Land is fairly inexpensive. What about the tax and price adjusted cost of living? Indexing all this to the last one and this one as well, to Dallas being 100. There are cheaper places to live with overall lower cost of living, not lower taxes because we have no income taxes, but the cost of living in some of America's cities is less, especially since our house prices have gone up a lot here. But still fairly cheap here compared to many of the other cities. But even none of these factors really make as much difference as these two big factors, water and electricity. A mid-sized data center uses about 300,000 gallons of water a day. equal to the water, that's not right, equal to 100,000 homes. Water's used more than, that can't be right. I'm sorry, because that just means the typical home uses 3 gallons of water a day. I made a mistake there. A mid-sized data center has a capacity of about 5 to 20 megawatts of electricity. The typical home runs on just what runs, you got running in your home on average over the year, 1,214 watts. So running at 80% capacity, a mid-sized data center can demand as much electricity as 3,500 to 14,000 homes. So that's a lot of electricity and water use. Water is used to cool off the electricity, the heat created by the electricity, and by the way, that water then can be recycled for agricultural use. 98% of it in California goes to agricultural use. So it's not like it's just going to be wasted. All right, now, so we have to look at water rates and electricity rates. Water rates near the Great Lakes, relatively cheap. They're the cheapest. Dallas, still not very expensive. This is per 1,000 gallons. Can be really expensive elsewhere. And so water is important. But the most important factor is electricity. I'll show you why in a minute. Dallas has the cheapest electricity rates. These are state electricity rates because you can pipe electricity across the state, and we do transport it across the state. And Dallas has very inexpensive electricity, deregulation, and so on. So our electricity rates are very affordable, and that attracts a lot of companies to our area. Now, there's been good research done, a lot of scientific, a lot of journal research and papers done. This is my favorite one, which has looked at the relative use of water and electricity and the growing use of water and electricity by the data centers across the planet. And what it shows is that, let me just tell you the conclusion. On average, data storage centers use about 7.6 times as many 100 kilowatt hours of electricity as they do thousands of gallons of water. So we can use this information to determine the standardized overall utility costs of operating a data storage center in any U.S. city. We can standardize it, assuming that plant uses the 7.6 industry average ratio of electricity to water, and then they buy it at local electricity and water rates. If you do that, and you index it to 100, okay, Rick, I'm almost finished. Index it to 100, then what you find out is that our utility costs are the cheapest of any of these 20 biggest cities, 100. And you can see how high it can get, up to 145% more than that for Santa Clara, and then all the California cities are expensive, New York, Boston, and so on. So this is a cheap place to run a co-location center, or for that matter, a hyperscale center. We just don't have the government as a customer. So in conclusion, co-location centers tend to be associated a lot more with the local economy than do hyperscalers. The hyperscalers will rent out stuff to a lot of other places elsewhere. And in that regard, Dallas's niche in the cloud will likely continue doing well. That word second do doesn't belong there. Doing well based on the strength and resilience of our economy. So you can look for more good news in that area. While we can expect Dallas to continue growing its presence in the hyperscale data center space, there's not strong reasons to expect we're going to be a huge player there, because the big customers, government. Even so, it's a good idea for our city leaders to look at the cost-benefit analysis of bringing these hyperscalers in, look at the trade-off to attract these opportunities to our metro area. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Mike. And now we have Mark Curriden. Mark is the founder of the Texas Lawbook, which is a source of news on the corporate law business in the state of Texas. And he is going to let you look at some of his proprietary data that shows that he's collected, that the organization has collected itself, that shows some interesting trends in the corporate law market.
Thanks, Rick. And by the way, if you miss any of this, Rick will have a replay on his OnlyFans page a little later. So a few things to start off with is these are big factors that are taking place today in corporate law. We have, right now we have about 8,000 corporate lawyers, business lawyers operating at the bigger firms. Bigger firms are firms that we consider full service firms. They have transactional practices, mergers, acquisitions, joint ventures, contracts, capital markets, anything like that. Litigation, complex commercial litigation, antitrust, intellectual property, et cetera. Then bankruptcy, regulatory practices. These are the main practices that you'll see in a large law firm. When I came here in 1996, there were really probably about 24 law firms that dominated the market. You had the V&Es, Vincent & Elkins, the Baker Botts, the Fulbright and Jaworskis, Bracewell, and then Andrews Kurth, et cetera. What we've seen happen in the past few years, especially since the creation of the Lawbook in 2011, is a massive invasion from national global law firms that have moved into Texas. Now, a lot of these firms tried to move into Texas in the 1990s or even in the 80s. A few had success, very few. Jones Day, Weil Godshaw, but they had specific specialties. But what happened is that they just didn't survive for the most part. A lot of the other firms that tried to move in. What happened and I'm going to show you a little bit about what occurred in the change, et cetera. But you have a supply and demand. You've got free agency. Free agency, it's like baseball. It's the lateral practice. Law firms came in, started offering more money, guaranteed packages to partners to move from one law firm to another firm. Some of the big, wealthy firms were able to offer 5-year guarantees for $7 to $9 million per lawyer to move from one practice and take their book of business to the other. And then the client base changed. Private equity. Nothing changed the world in Texas and the practice of law like private equity and some other deep-pocketed clients. This is what really made a difference. Did a piece back in about 2008 during the recession. Wayne Watts gave me an interview. He was the general counsel of AT&T, probably the largest consumer of business law in Texas. At one point, after their merger with Time Warner, they had DirecTV. They had more than 1,000 lawyers in-house and at AT&T, and then they also probably hired about 2,500 lawyers outside for all of its different businesses. They're both plaintiffs and defendants in patent litigation. They're just all kinds of labor and employment, contracts, retail, property, real estate, et cetera. But he gave an interview that said corporations today hire lawyers, not law firms. And about 2010, 2011, a couple of law firms decided, let's test that. And there were national law firms like Latham and Watkins and Sidley and Gibson Dunn. And so they said, let's find out if that's now true. Because up until then, firms like AT&T, ExxonMobil, Shell, et cetera, and the corporations changed too. You had Blockbuster, that was here. Not here anymore. But they would hire law firms, an Aiken Gump, a V&E, a Baker Botts, whatever it was. They would hire them, and they would do almost all their work. Well, when they just went to hire just lawyers instead of law firms, they were looking for specialty practices. Who is the best at antitrust? Who is the best at patent? Who is the best at doing M&A? Mergers, acquisitions, capital markets, corporate finance, et cetera, healthcare, whatever it may be. And they weren't always at the same firms. Why did this happen? How did it happen? We had corporate boards that decided they wanted to start, especially if you're involved in a bet the company merger, bet the company litigation, battle with the government. You can say, hey, I hired so-and-so, we've always had them. But if the corporate board says who did you hire and why did we lose? If you hired the best firm and the best lawyer with the best reputation, the general counsel is going to be able to say, I hired the best. We just lost. And when Wayne made this, the test was on. Here are the what Texas had as far as revenues. These were just the increases in the past few years. You saw it really had a boom coming out of the pandemic. Lawyers there weren't enough lawyers. There actually weren't enough lawyers. Starting in about 2018, 2019, we've really only grown about 25% of the number of corporate lawyers in Texas. And yet business has just thrived, and that's what's led to price increases. We'll get a little bit of that later. But in 2021, business was just so good that the firms couldn't hire enough lawyers. Business was just overwhelming. Hiring spree began. And it really began in late 2018, 2019. Firms just the business kept coming in. Private equity was buying up a lot of land, a lot of assets in the oil and gas patch, in the Permian in particular. And they just needed lawyers to do the transactional work. And we've seen that even recently. Corporate M&A practices have really been the basis for a lot of the growth. And we track that at the Texas Lawbook. We track every lawyer and every firm based in Texas that has worked on or led a merger, an acquisition, a joint venture, a capital market, whatever it may be, a funding. And if you look, they've just skyrocketed. The numbers have skyrocketed north. And they just haven't been able to find enough lawyers in many of the years. So we saw major hiring growth. And how did they get them? Of course, they're recruiting out of the law schools in Texas, but they recruit... For the most part, they try to get the top 15% from the big law schools. Stanford, University of Chicago, Yale, Harvard, Penn, et cetera, Columbia, Vanderbilt, where I went to law school. So, and SMU, UT, Texas A&M now in Fort Worth, big recruiters and heavy duty. Now, they also have a problem, and that is law firms are battling what every place is battling is diversity issues. And it's a big issue. Last year, the 1Ls in law school, first-year law students, there were less than 150 first-year African-American law students. That's less than 4% of all law students. And they came from only 2 law schools. More than 70% came from 2 law schools. And they're 2 law schools that most of the corporate firms don't even recruit from. So these are things that law firms are having to really address because the clients are requiring it. The clients are requiring because their customer bases are diverse. They want their law firms and the lawyers they're working on their litigation and their deals to be diverse. The number of full-service corporate firms has grown. The firms from 36 in 2015 to 68 in 2023. The number of firms, the lawyers working at those same 68 law firms, however, has only increased by 26%. The revenue generated by the top 50 firms operating in Texas went from $3.8 billion to $8.6 billion in 2022. In the next month, probably in the next 5 weeks, we'll be publishing 2023 data. It's well over $9 billion for the top 50 corporate law firms now. Corporate law firms at the end of the 20th century, as I mentioned, who those were. In 2021, the national firms started opening. Mentioned that Latham & Watkins started opening here. The way they did it was they started hiring from Aiken Gump, from Vincent & Elkins, Baker Botts. Those firms started hiring partners already with contacts, connections in the state. And then you see the list of the firms that have moved in more recently in the past few years. They're just plentiful. They've also seen a number of mergers that took place. Norton Rose Fulbright was Fulbright and Jaworski. That was the first one. It took place in about 2013. And then, since then, Andrews Kurth was taken over by Hunton. Strasburger became merged with Clark Hill, Gardier with Foley, Thompson and Knight, and so forth. And then other firms have been opening offices. We just have Paul Hastings, L.A. Founded firm, has announced just past week that it's opening an office here. So they'll be opening up in Dallas in the next couple of weeks. Here's the head count for the firms, top 50. Some of the ones, these are the ones that are from the national firms from 2014 are in red. and then you go to 2022, and the same one for the national firms in red. You'll see how it's changed dramatically. The number of Texas-based firms has continued. A few have continued to grow, but most have declined slightly. Some have just disappeared. The national firms have really taken over on the growth. 2014 revenues. This is even more important than headcount. Revenues, you saw Baker Botts, number 2, Andrews Kurth, Haynes and Boone, Norton Rose. This was after the Fulbright merger, Jackson Walker, et cetera. And then you take a look, okay, these are the national firms back then. You see how far down the numbers are. Only Norton Rose Fulbright, which was Fulbright and Jaworski, was in the top 10. And then you go to 2022, and there's the number. Kirkland & Ellis, a Chicago-founded firm, is now the largest law firm in Texas, operating by revenue and by a significant amount. And then you see the rest. It's a significant number that are based out of state. They're collecting the revenue. In 2011, the revenues of Texas offices of national law firms, the Jones Days, the Weil Gottschalks, et cetera, were less than $250 million. In 2022, those same national firms, not the same, obviously, so many more, now $5.26 billion. And with those national firms moving in, why are they getting more business? They're not only getting more of the Texas business, what we've also documented is they're getting more business outside of Texas. For example, more than half of the M&A deals led by Texas lawyers at national firms, the companies were based outside of Texas. So they get an expertise of oil and gas, but they're not just representing Texas oil and gas companies. They're representing oil and gas companies in Colorado, doing deals for CNOOC in China, or for the energy-owned company of India, or with Petrobras, et cetera. In 2011, 92% of the revenues generated by the top 50 firms operating in Texas went to law firms headquartered in Texas. By last 2022, 60% of the revenues were out-of-state firms, so we're down to 40%. Now, that being said, some of the Texas firms are doing very well. Don't get them wrong. Baker Botts has done pretty well. V&E has had record revenues year after year after year. Several of the major Texas firms are still doing very well. The national firms are just doing better. They've got deeper pockets. I'm going to get in a little bit here into the Kirkland & Ellis. For example, Chicago-based Kirkland & Ellis became the largest operating firm by revenue in Texas in 2021. This year, their revenues in Texas will top $800 million. Firm-wide, they're at about, I think, right about 7.5. No, well more than that. About $8 billion. About $8 billion. Their profits per partner at Kirkland & Ellis are now above $7.5 million per partner. The price for talent has just gone way up in Texas, and that's because partially of the shortage. First-year law students right out of law school, don't know where the courthouse is, are now making $230,000, plus their signing bonuses. Seventh-year associates, seventh and eighth-year associates are making a little more than $500,000. This is before they become partner. So, but it's partially because of the demand. And the bottom line was, is, for example, Kirkland and a few other firms in 2019, 2021 were so desperate for talent, fourth-year, fifth-year associates at firms that had M&A experience doing deals, especially with private equity, that they were offering $600,000 signing bonuses during those two time periods. So here's the revenue for Kirkland & Ellis. Kirkland & Ellis opened in Texas in 2014, April 2014. Now, they had a little bit of a hook in Texas. They represented British Petroleum, BP, in the oil spill litigation in the Gulf. But none of their lawyers were based here. So they opened in 2014. 2015, they had $64 million in revenue. It jumped up to 141, 187. You see the growth all the way up to $780 million. Their headcount has grown dramatically too. They'll probably pop over a little over 400 for 2023. You compare that and Vincent and Elkins, and again, V&E has had an extraordinary series of years. They were a firm that was threatened by Enron. Enron was their top client, but they buckled down. They focused on the business development. They shed a few practice groups. They focused on what they really needed to do to get their revenues per lawyer, profits per partner up, and you just see how the money followed. V&E made a strategic decision that when Kirkland and Latham and Gibson Dunn and all the others came in and raised their rates, had the high rates, firms in Texas had a choice. They could stay with the lower rates and still try to attract those clients or match the rates. V&E decided to match the rates. So, final couple of points. 11 lawyers were known to charge $1,000 an hour in Texas in 2011. We had 9 lawyers this past year that we documented are now charging $2,000 or more an hour. Seventh-year associates now routinely bill $1,000 an hour. And the invasion is still going on. We've had offices. King & Spalding just announced it's opening an office in Dallas this past week. Veronica Lewis Moyer was hired. She was at Gibson Dunn. She represents Microsoft. She's the only lawyer that's put Tim Cook on the witness stand. She's an amazing lawyer. Here with Gibson Dunn, they hired her away probably for buku bucks. And so, there you have it. Thank you so much.
So in 20 years, it appears that data centers have become critical infrastructure, and I would assume that if someone had a switch and turn them all off at the same time, it would be a disaster for the economy and probably for the world. Are they doing anything to protect themselves from electromagnetic pulses?
One thing I quickly realized in getting into this research is it is a massive black hole. I swear, the more time I spend in this area, the less I feel like I know. It just happened to me again today. And the answer to your question is, I don't know. It is such a massive amount of knowledge to be had in this area that I just can't. Every time I get in there, I think, oh, I just got to stop because it's consuming me. It's not the air. As soon as it's over with, I'm going to go get a drink, and I'm not going to get back into this data anymore. So please.
But it sounds like we need some lawyers to jump on it. That's the question.
If you find out, please let me know. But we've been working on this I have been for 2 months, and I feel like I know nothing compared to what there is to be known.
For corporate law firms, national corporate law firms, do you see that trend continuing into the future, or do you picture this sort of coexistence?
No, I mean, it's here to stay. Look, I mean, we just all of a sudden have had 2 global firms that have moved in. Clifford Chance, a Magic Circle firm, has moved in. One of the big national firms, Sherman & Sterling, is merging with another. So it's going to continue because business is global. K&O Gates took over Hughes & Luce back in the day, right? And K&O Gates has 2,500 lawyers worldwide. Baker McKenzie, which has been here for a long time, they've got about 4,000, 5,000 lawyers globally. So no, it's happening. The key will be for every law firm to find 2 or 3 practice areas, specialties, antitrust, litigation, mergers and acquisitions, capital markets, where they are top of the market, where their lawyers are the best. And then they can supply the rest of the lawyers, give them the work to go with it, such as executive compensation, labor and employment, tax, et cetera.
And a quick follow-up to that one as well, if you don't mind. That would be, how are these Texas kind of headquartered firms adapting? What are they doing to sort of stay in that top 10 of revenues or in that mainstream, retaining those?
Changing their comps. They're focusing more on they've got to, look, every day, the problem that corporate law firms have, they're very fragile. Law firms are very fragile. You think, oh, they're big, they're making all this money. But every day, their only asset walks out the door. That's the lawyers. And the question is, will they come back the next day? Or will another law firm, between the time they walk out the door, meet with them for dinner and say, oh, we'd like to offer you head of a practice and so forth. So the firms have got to, or are adjusting their compensation, focusing on key practice groups. So used to be lockstep pay at big firms in Texas. All partners get the same. Not the way anymore. The top billers, the top people bringing in the most business are making considerably more than the others.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, I had a question about the dynamics of the legal market, the labor market for legal services. Do you perceive the focusing in on like the top 15% of these elite law schools as being just so that they can tell their clients that we have the best lawyers in the world, or is it actually like there's actual considerable differences in skill? Because it seems like if we're forever focusing on these, like this marketing of being able to say that we have the best lawyers, then there's going to be no end in sight to how high these salaries you're going to get.
You're absolutely right. Look, we've got some law firms that are expanding. Taking a look at Yvette Ostalaza has said, you know, she's at Sidley, the head at Sidley. She's added about 20 law firms to their recruiting group. The best lawyers, most successful lawyers in Texas did not graduate top of their class. The most profitable lawyer in Texas history is Joe Jamail. He graduated last in his class at the University of Texas. And he was the most successful trial lawyer in Texas history. And you have to, you know, right now at all the law schools, there are these gems, and that's what the law firms have to do. Whether UNT law school, where these, you know, you got police officers working all day, going to law school at night. And these lawyers are one day going to turn out to be really great lawyers. And what I'm writing about is, and what our team is doing more is, you better start paying attention, because they're going to kick some of the big law firms' ass someday in court. They're going to be really good because they've got learned experience, they know life, you know, so they really need to expand.
Didn't you tell me once that you don't learn anything about the law at law school?
You don't learn anything about practicing law at law school. My friend Gary would probably tell you that. So, you know, look, I mean, it's you know, law firms get into this routine and they think, you know, we've got our clients expect it. But I think clients are starting to ask more questions. Last night I had dinner with 6 general counsel. And they're like, no, we want them to expand. We want them to recruit, you know, start looking at different people to bring in to their summer associate programs, which is where the recruiting process begins.
Last question.
Okay, I was amazed at how robust Texas exports were as against California. Now, I think California is one of the biggest economies in the world, and I know we have a bigger border and cross-town cities. Is there something else that causes us to have so much better exports in California?
Well, again, is the way Texas, the role that Texas plays in this U.S.-Mexico trade exchange. So it's the main intermediary of this U.S.-Mexico trade exchange. And why? Well, because is the state with the most crossing points between the two countries. And in addition to that, Texas border with the states that are more economically developed, the most industrialized states, like Nuevo León, Chihuahua, Coahuila, you know, where we have all these manufacturing plants servicing the U.S. market. And then another point, in favor of Texas is that once the goods cross, they go to the Northeast, right? Like this huge market that is in the U.S. I mean, the connections are really easy, the roads and all the infrastructure to connect all that kind of trade.
Okay.
Logic would say that the reason that manufacturing base is so large on the border is cost of labor, right?
Yes.
You know, so labor is the cost of many things. It's first it's energy, second it's labor, probably, right? Mm-hmm. So if, as we hear, robotics, AI, which also helps in speeding up that technology, where does that lead to? Lack of laborers, more robotics. What is that going to do over 20 years at this exchange?
Yeah, that's a great question, and yeah, I've been writing about that a little bit as well. I mean, when I go and talk to them, the industry players, I keep asking that question, particularly in terms of electrical vehicles, because the way, the U.S.-Mexico trade relationship, like the great majority of those exports and imports are automotive parts, right? And when you look at electrical vehicles, you need less automotive parts, right? And I keep asking them, guys, are you ready for this transition? Are you getting ready for what is coming? And they just keep telling me that yes, and that they are talking to the U.S. counterpart, right, about what kind of strategies they need to implement in order to service the new kind of trade. But it's a big question that is very important to address, not only for the Mexican side, but also for the U.S. side, because you saw the impact on the border economy. Yeah.
So if anybody has TV or listens to the radio, we keep hearing about close the border, close the border, close the border.
Yeah.
So how would that impact the trade between the two countries?
Just imagine, right? I mean, it will have a huge impact, right? And again, close the border to what? To people, to goods, to services. I mean, for me, it's just rhetoric, right? Because it's really hard to stop this kind of manufacturing relationship that we have. And it's a win-win situation. It's not like one wins and the other one loses. We both win. I mean, we three countries win, right? And together, as a trade bloc, compete with the rest of the world. As you saw, 40 cents are already, when you import from Mexico, they were originated in the US. 35, when you import from Canada, were originated in the US. Altogether, on average, it's like 35 cents originated in North America when you import from each other, right? So we compete against China or other trade blocs for the global markets, right? So if we mess with this trade relationship, I mean, we mess with our North American economy.